Hi everyone. This short video is going to talk about different types of sources that you might be using in your papers, how to tell them apart, and what you really should be looking for in a source. Okay, let's get started. So first of all, we should probably talk about why do we use sources? Why not just say what we think? Isn't everyone entitled to some sort of an opinion? Well, not exactly. We use sources in academic writing because most of us aren't experts. We build our credibility and authority by proving that we've read widely and deeply in a certain subject area. And we also use sources to build trust with our readers because a reader is going to trust someone that they know is not just kind of talking off the top of their head. They want to know what you've read and how you've come up with your ideas. And the sources are the way you're going to do that. So what types of sources are available for students to use? Well, we can break them down a couple different ways. First off, we can think about online sources versus print sources. Now, online sources can either be those general internet sources you get through search engines like Google or Bing, and they can also be sources from the library database, either the PGCC library database or your local library's web holdings. Sources can also be in print. These would be your books, magazines, journals, newspapers. But the thing about print is that they're really limited to physical availability. 10, 15 years ago, if you wanted to find a source and your library didn't actually hold that physical volume, right, the book, the magazine, the journal that you could get your hands on, you would either have to drive to a different library that did have the source, or you would have to put in what was called a request. You'd fill out this piece of paper, they would fax it off to the library that held the source, and they would either send you the book to use, or they would make an actual photocopy of the article and send it back to your library. It was a very, very time-consuming process. Luckily, fast forward a decade or more, and what's happened is that most print sources, especially the journal and the articles, those are available on the web so that we no longer have to worry about what's actually in our library building because those databases open us up to lots of different libraries. Okay, so let's start talking about online sources. You're probably familiar with general internet searches. Everybody knows how to Google or use Bing or Yahoo or whatever your preferred internet search engine is. There are some online sources that can be acceptable. These are especially the sources that end with .gov or .edu. These two particular endings show that it's either a government source or an educational institution source. Now, they're not always acceptable, so you should always check with your professor. Sometimes .coms or .nets or even .orgs, which are nonprofits, can be acceptable as well. But in order to use those kind of sources, we have to ask ourselves a few questions. First of all, who is the author? Many websites don't actually have an author written down anywhere. And you want to ask yourself, do you really feel confident using a source when the writer wasn't willing to put his or her name on it? And the other thing that you want to pay attention to is, when was that source last updated? People put websites up online all the time and then forget about them. 3, 4, 5 years later, that information might not be valid anymore. So if it's not a website that's being currently maintained and updated, that's a really good signal that you should maybe not use it. But again, you always want to check with your professor. Some professors, like me, do not accept internet sources unless you get them specifically cleared. Now, one thing to note is that when you're using any sort of general internet source, you, the writer, is responsible for evaluating the content and authority of that source. And just remember, pretty much any Yahoo can put something online. It doesn't make them an authority. Okay, so what kind of online sources are from authorities? These are so easy to find because you can find them all through the Prince George's Community College library databases. Database resources are kind of magical because you don't have to go through the kind of questioning you do with general internet sources. The reason for this is that everything that you find on the PGCC library website is paid content. That means that your tuition dollars have helped to pay for access to those sources. And we've all heard the saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch. That's kind of true with research as well. The best information is written by writers who get paid for it. And if a writer's going to get paid for it, somebody's got to pay, right? So these database resources are paid content. They're often the web version of the print sources. So you're going to be able to find newspapers, magazines, journals, books, and even movies online. The best part, though, is that all of the database resources have been fact-checked, edited, and approved by someone who knows well enough to make those decisions. Now, these online sources can contain primary, secondary, or tertiary sources. What does that mean? Well, this is one more way we can break down and think about the types of sources available to us. Primary sources are original sources. If you sit down and write a diary, dear diary, this is what I did today, and 100 years from now somebody finds your diary, that would be a primary source for your life. We could be talking about artifacts, we could be talking about texts that people have written. These are unfiltered and uninterpreted sources. They're kind of from the horse's mouth. Secondary sources are sources that write about or interpret primary sources. We're talking newspaper articles, magazine articles, books, right? The great thing about secondary sources is that they offer the benefit of hindsight. Usually secondary sources are edited, fact-checked, or peer-reviewed. Finally, there's this thing called tertiary sources, and you're probably more familiar with these kind of sources than you realize. A tertiary source collects and distills information from primary and secondary sources. So these are kind of like reference books. These are your encyclopedias, sometimes your dictionaries, sometimes your reports. What the tertiary source does is boil things down more simply. It doesn't usually contain the complexity of the secondary source. So which type of source should you really try to find most often? Well, all of these sources can be fine for an academic paper, but your goal should really be that middle one, the secondary sources. These are going to be shorter sources, they're going to be authoritative because they've been researched and fact-checked, but they're not going to be so simple as an encyclopedia article. Okay, so let's talk about some more source distinctions that we can think about as we look into researching. So there's a difference between commercial sources, professional or trade sources, and academic or scholarly sources. Commercial sources, you're totally familiar with these. These are the magazines and newspapers that you see when you're standing at the checkout line at Giant, right? These are sources intended for a general public. The vocabulary is very accessible. They're not going to use any kind of specific language that the majority of people wouldn't be able to read. Commercial sources are often for a profit. That means they're going to be filled with advertisements. Did you know that when you get a magazine, you're not really paying for that magazine, especially when you have a subscription? The thing that pays for the magazine are all those ads and commercials that are inside of it. So there's usually lots of those in a commercial source. Commercial sources always use editors. These are people who decide what the layout of the magazine is going to be, what each particular article should and should not say, and whether or not they're going to publish those articles. Now, the next kind of source is a professional or a trade source. And you can usually find these at like Barnes & Noble under the special headings on the magazine rack. These are kind of sources like if you're a writer, there's certain writing magazines. So the general public's not going to pick up, but if you're trying to get published and you want specialized information, that's where you would go. They're meant for specific trades, and most trades, most businesses, most types of businesses, they have their own magazine. The vocabulary might be specialized, so they'll be using the jargon of the business. But the thing is, the vocabulary will still be accessible. These aren't really overly scholarly pieces. Now, these could be either edited or peer-reviewed. Usually they're edited. They have an editor who makes decisions about what will be published and what won't. Okay, let's go to the academic or scholarly sources. Now, academic and scholarly sources are something called peer-reviewed. What does that mean? There's a big difference between publishing in an academic source and publishing in a commercial source. If I wanted to write an article to be published in, say, Time magazine, I would write my article and I would send it to the editor of Time magazine and say, hey, would you like to publish my article? And the editor would say, yeah, or no, no way, who are you? When you're submitting something to a scholarly source, that's not what happens. The first thing that happens is the editor looks at it and sees if it's valid for the magazine or the journal. Then the editor sends that particular article to 2 to 4 different readers. Now, the readers don't have any idea who wrote the article. It's what's called a blind submission. The author's name's not on it. And these readers are experts in whichever field the author's trying to get published in. These 2 to 4 experts will write a review. They'll say, yeah, this actually adds to the scholarly discipline, or you know what, this isn't really worth publishing. The editor will collect those reviews and based upon what other peers or experts in the field say will decide whether or not to publish something. Now, academic sources like journals, they're usually not for profit. They do tend to be the most in-depth and complex though. So if we think about these different distinctions, commercial sources are your magazines, your newspapers, and books. Professional and trade sources, trade journals, and books. And academic and scholarly sources, journals, books, and dissertations. So how do you tell the difference between a magazine and a journal? Well, magazine articles are usually shorter. You're not usually going to find a magazine article that's longer than 5 to 6 pages. They're edited by an editor rather than reviewed by a set of your peers. Authors are paid for their work. When the editor decides to publish you, you get paid. You get a check in the mail. They're for profit, which means they're filled with advertisements, and it also means that they tend to be more visually appealing. And magazines are published weekly or monthly. Journals have longer articles. These are 10 pages or more long usually upwards to 20 to 30 pages. Authors are not paid for their articles. Being published in a peer-reviewed journal is how you get promotions in the scholarly world, but you don't get a check. They're not for profit, which means that the individual journal issues are very expensive. Sometimes they cost $60, $70 an issue, and basically only libraries buy them. They're not usually visually appealing. You can tell it's a journal article if there's no images. And journals, because they're so expensive and because these articles are so long, are usually published 1 to 4 times a year. So what if you don't know? You Google it. Nobody expects you to know every title of every periodical out there. But once you Google the title of the periodical, you can get a sense of, would you buy this? Would anybody you know buy this? Is it visually appealing? How often is it published? And you can make a pretty educated guess about what it is. So what sources should you use? Well, that depends on 4 things. First of all, your level of knowledge. The more that you know about a discipline, the kind of more complex source you should be using. But you shouldn't necessarily be using a source that's not accessible or is too complex, right? And you also want to think about the authority. Think about it this way. You should read the source that you can actually read. So if your Works Cited page is filled with 5 books, well, your professor pretty much knows you didn't read those books. Or if your Works Cited page is filled with only big academic articles meant for scientists or researchers in a specific field, your professor's probably going to figure you didn't completely read those articles. When you cite an article, what you're saying is, I understand this source and I'm going to use it. So the source you should use is the one that you can understand.